Hello and welcome to this presentation on writing your methodology and methods chapter or section of your dissertation. So what are we going to be looking at? Well, we're going to be presenting some ideas, strategies and concepts, which will mean that at the end of this, you should be able to do a number of things. The first thing you'll be able to do is explain your methodology and your methods, and really focusing on what this sectional chapter should include. You'll also be able to start applying using some of the techniques and strategies we're going to highlight in order to structure this chapter or section effectively, and also to write it effectively. So we'll be looking at language and phrases that we can use to start explaining our methods and methodology. And throughout this presentation, there will be various times when you'll be asked to start creating and add to what will become, hopefully, a rough plan for you for this chapter. So that's what we're aiming to do. Can I just suggest that everybody gets a pen and piece of paper, and obviously we're going to need that for the plan writing, but also remembering that we don't want to just passively consume any information that we're being sent at the moment. We need to try and remain, as far as possible, given our circumstances, active learners. This means engaging with anything that you're sent like this or webinars in a really positive manner, and note making can be a really good, easy, powerful way of engaging positively in our learning. And a little tip perhaps about note making is that, often we think, right, I'm going to make notes, and then you sort of lose focus. What should you be writing down? Well, I've sort of gone through here the aims of this session, and many other sessions that you'll be presented from your course teams and maybe other members of my team, the academic achievement team, will start with some aims or objectives of the session. And these are really good for focusing you on what you're going to be learning about, but also to help you focus on what you should take notes about, because you can turn these aims into questions. Then you can write the questions on your notepad, and then as the presentation continues and those questions are answered, the answers become your notes. So here, explain what your methodology and methods section should include. That can be turned into, very simply, what should your methodology section include? And then further down, what should your methods section include? And as those questions are answered, you can obviously input the notes about that. Similarly, which techniques should you use? What are the techniques? Again, as I review those, you can write them down. So this is a simple way of working out how to make notes from sessions. And it's also a strategy that you can apply to your own reading. Before you start reading anything, have a think about what you want to take from that reading. What questions do you want answered? What information do you want? Write a question. And then as you go through the reading and the answers to the question emerge, that's what you write down. So this is a way of remaining active in our learning and also creating focused, useful notes. So let's move on. So methods and methodology chapter, what is it for? Well, this is a really central section or chapter of your dissertation. And it's really the place where you explain to the reader how you conducted your research, what did you do, and most importantly, why you did it that way. Remember, there are a whole range of different methodologies and methods that can be selected to carry out research. And I'm sure you've come across these in your reading of journal papers where you've looked at different pieces of research and seen how they were carried out. You might well have compared and contrasted some of these approaches within your literature review. So you, as in the same way as the researchers who created those journal papers, you are a researcher as well. And this is your opportunity to explain how and why you carried out your research in this way. This is your opportunity to join that research community in a way by acknowledging that academic research has an underpinning methodology, or is underpinned with theoretical ideas and concepts. And these theoretical ideas and concepts connect to methods, the way that research is carrying out. This is your opportunity to explore these areas, learn about them, and then apply them to your research. This is the difference between you just asking people a few random questions and you really focusing on whether asking questions face-to-face would be the right way or through a questionnaire. You focusing on what kind of questions, and you stepping back and thinking, well, what is it I want to know? Why do I want to know that? And to some extent, this links with a bigger area. This chapter sort of acknowledges that we as researchers might have different views on how data can be created. And these views are aligned with philosophy of research. So this chapter is about what you did and why you did it, and justifying the choices that you've made, just as you've seen other researchers do in journal papers. Now, this leads me on to a point which is really quite important here. The words methodology and methods are often used interchangeably as if they're synonyms or they mean the same thing, but they're not. They're two different things, and you must address them separately within this chapter. Your methodology leads you to selection of methods. They are connected. And your choice of methodology then leads you to choosing a method. And this chapter is really central to explaining these choices, why you made these choices, why this methodology led to the choice of these methods. And overall, remember though, this is not theoretical in content, this chapter. This is not a place where you just write down lots of things about different forms of methodology and methods. This chapter is related to you and your research. So why was the method selected? Why were the methodologies selected or methodology selected? Why were they the best choices in relation to what you are researching and what you want to find out? This is your opportunity to become part of that research community. So let's just have a little stop and think about where we need to be before we move on into looking at structuring and writing. So just for yourselves, you need to focus on whether you're writing a separate methods and methodology chapter, or for some of you, this section might be included in your introduction. So where does it go? How long does it need to be? Also, go back to any Canvas materials, any guidance you've got from your course teams about this chapter, as you would with any other chapter in a dissertation. Be guided by them. Or if you've had any sessions on this chapter with your supervisor, go back to any notes you may have made. Just refocus on what this is for you, chapter, section. Have you been given any particular guidance about how people within your discipline, researchers within your discipline, would structure this section? Just refocus. Also important here, as I've mentioned before, it's really important that we do understand the difference between methodologies and methods. They're two different things, two connected but different things. So your methodology, as I mentioned earlier, is connected to how you think data should be collected. and how you think data should be analysed. And then the methods are how you did that. So I just want everybody to look at the blue box on the right hand side here. Have a look at these words and phrases. These are connected with our methodology and our methods. So as you can see, if we look at the beginning of this blue box, we have philosophy, research paradigm. So some of you will need to be writing at this point. And here we usually say, if you have had research methods, modules or sessions where your lecturers have taught you about research paradigms, where you have heard the words positivism, constructivism, interpretivism, this means that your lecturer is expecting you to start at this level within this chapter, and there will need to be some explanation of your choice of research philosophy or paradigm. Other courses and programs do not deal with research from that point. So for some of you, you will be starting this chapter at the methodology section. And the language connected to that are words like qualitative or quantitative. Sorry, I haven't got my teeth in. You might have had some discussion or sessions also about choosing a methodology which is aligned with a particular lens or standpoint. So you might be looking at things from a feminist perspective, a particular political perspective. Again, these are aligned to your course, the sessions you've had and discussions with your supervisor. But you need to just get this clear to yourself that here we've got philosophy and methodology, and these are the words and phrases used around those terms, and these are the sorts of things that you will need to be writing about. So if all this language is looking slightly familiar, but you're not entirely sure, this is a good place, now we're starting this first steps, to write down that possibly you need to go back and do a little bit more reading and review any Canvas information. Methods is related to how you carried out the research. What did you do? Some of you who were working in sciences perhaps or engineering, you might be doing laboratory-based experimentation. Other people might be looking at archives. These are our methods. Our design then moves our methods into a practical plan. And this practical plan needs to be described and evaluated in this chapter as well. So if you did carry out experimentation in a laboratory, for example, what equipment did you use? If you used any kind of software, SPSS, NVivo, for example, this needs to be clear in our research design. Our research design also needs to include things like participants, how participants were recruited, this sort of information. So this is just a pause section here, just reminding us of the sort of areas that we'll need to be structuring, writing about. Maybe as a little bit of a reminder that if we're approaching this chapter with only our own research clear to us, we may need to start expanding our reading and research in order to contextualize our research. This is not just you writing about what you did. There needs to be a theoretical underpinning to explain why you did something and what you did. And so you will need to have read some resources on research. Now, again, that does not mean that this section becomes a huge descriptive section of all the different methodologies and methods that could be used. Remember, we are focusing on our research. But in order to explain our choices, we will need to read in order to be able to convey that and make that clear to the reader. Okay. So let's move on to planning. the structure of this particular chapter, there isn't a right and wrong way. And as I said earlier, if you have things on Canvas or you've discussed this with your supervisor, please be aware that that's the highest level of advice. We deal with people generally across the university, and things might be particular to your program or discipline. But this model is a fairly, it's a good model that can be applied to many different disciplines for this chapter. So what you'll see here is an inverted triangle. And this triangle reflects the organisation of the chapter. So you would start off, if you are writing from this point, by discussing your choice of research philosophy or paradigm. Are you looking at things from a positivist perspective, and why? Are you looking at things from a constructivist perspective, and why? Then we move down, and this is the point where some of you are going to start. What's the methodology then connected to the choice of this paradigm? Or what is your methodology? Are you looking at quantitative, qualitative? What are we doing? Are you looking at creating a large volume of data? Are we looking at some in-depth, deep analysis? Then, obviously, connected to that are the methods that we select. Then, particular information about the research design, as I discussed earlier. And then, finally, a little bit of analysis of the method that you've selected. Some discussion about any possible limitations. So as you see, we've started off looking generally at research philosophy, which can be applied to a huge range of subjects, a huge different varieties of research. Similarly, we've come down to methodology. But gradually, the structure of this chapter moves from general, broad analysis. But at each point, that doesn't mean that you're ignoring your own research. You will need to connect that analysis to your own research. But as we move down the structure of the chapter, you'll see that our final sections relate very deeply and very closely to our own methods. So what I'd like you to do now is to pause this presentation for a moment. And using this model or any other suggestive structures that you have, I'd like you just to make a rough plan of your own chapter. Are you starting at the philosophy paradigm level, or are you starting at a methodology level? And underneath, don't just write methodology if possible. Which methodology are you using? You could just list your research methods, list some key points about your research design, and maybe some points about what was good or bad about the method that you selected. So you might want to pause and do that. All right, so now we've looked at structure, we're moving on to thinking about the writing. As we can see, we've got a structure of the chapter, and hopefully you've paused to write a rough plan about what you might write within each of the sections that I've suggested. But what do you write in detail within those sections? Let's start with methodology, which is the point that many of us will be starting. Which methodology have you chosen? These are questions you need to be addressing and answering in your writing. Remember, if we look at this question, this is about you. This is not summarize lots of research methodologies. Which one have you selected? And why was this the best choice for your research? That's what the reader needs to leave this chapter understanding. We also need to address any limitations to this methodology. And again, this is where our research and reading comes in. We must acknowledge that there may be some issues with the methodology we've chosen, but we acknowledge them. But obviously, even though there may be limitations, that still meant that this methodology was the best approach for you. So what you need to do is to acknowledge some limitations, but then explain why this methodology was still superior to others. Thinking about your research, your project, focusing on starting in the middle from your research and thinking about the choices you made connected to that, what you're researching and what you want to find out. Not starting from the level where we show lots and lots of reading about methodology, but without applying it to us and our research. So, how are you going to do this? How are you going to answer these questions in this particular section? What I'm going to show you in a moment, in the next slide, is a paragraph from a student's methodology and methods chapter, and this section deals with methodology. And what I'd like you to do is to read through, and again, going back to the points I made at the beginning, try and read with a purpose. Try and think about what you want to take from a reading. So as you're reading this example paragraph, I'd like you to think about these questions. Looking at the sentences that you can see that are outlining possible limitations, as I've mentioned, as necessary. Where is this student highlighting their selection of methodology? Do you think that they have explained their choice adequately? Do you think they are really making it clear to the reader why these choices were made and why they were superior for their research project? And looking for sentences where they might be explaining why it's appropriate. So these are things I'd like you to focus on as you read this paragraph. So, let's see, how did you get on? Well, as we can see here, at the beginning, the student is outlining their methodology, although obviously you might have seen this, their use of language is a little bit non-exact here because they've put this research employed a qualitative method. And obviously this isn't a method, it's a methodology. So, but they have immediately connected their choice to their research. It's immediate why they've chosen this for their research. And then they have moved on to discussing why it's appropriate. They're suggesting that there are some factors in this methodological approach which are really relevant to the research that they're doing. Again, I think if we were being critical, I think some of that could have been more directly related to their research. We've got the phrase ability to deal with complicated situations. Perhaps it might have been useful if they'd expanded on that and explained which complicated situations their research was actually dealing with. But they have explained in some ways the appropriateness of this choice. Then they have addressed some limitations or negative aspects of this particular methodological choice. And as we move down here, they are continuing that analysis, and they are looking at this choice in a critical way. But as we move down through the black section into the purple section, what we see here is a student trying to explain the choice, but in ways that aren't really academically appropriate. And this is something you need to be aware of. Having no knowledge of statistics is not really an adequate explanation for choosing one thing over another. Remember, a dissertation is an academic journey, and on that journey we might need to develop additional skills and abilities in order to complete it. That's normal. So it's not really adequate to say that you couldn't do something because you didn't necessarily have the skills, if those skills could have been developed. And obviously analysis of statistics is a possibility, because we have, obviously my team, we have maths and statistics tutors that run many sessions on statistics and software packages to do this. if you've addressed this in your research module, this means that your lecturers are indicating that they would expect you to develop these skills. So in reality, that's not a justification. So we need to be wary of that. We need to ensure that any justification is really based on analysis of source, analysis of research in relation to that methodology, and that research applied to our own situation. We cannot say we chose something because we just couldn't do other things. All right, so let's move. Let's go back to your plan. And let's think about this justifying. Why did you choose your methodology? Can you add any notes to it? What made you choose one methodology over another? Perhaps you've already done some reading. Perhaps you've already thought about this in your process of research, and you know that you rejected one approach over another. So let's have a look at that critically and add that information to our plans. Okay, so now let's move on to writing our methods section. Similarly, to your methodology section, you're going to use the same questioning technique. You are going to describe and explain the choice of methods, obviously making the connection between the methodology, making sure that obviously if we started at a research philosophy level, if we said we were going to, explore things from a positivist perspective, we're looking then at creating data which is numeric. So we will possibly be looking at using questionnaires. So there's a logical link between our choices. So we need to make sure that we have understood, going back to that first steps checklist, we've understood the connections and the language and what all this means. So we will explain and justify. So if we look again, here are the same questions, but this time we're going to look at the section of students' work from their methods section. Again, look at the questions and think about our answers. What do we think about this piece of writing? Is it good? Is it adequate? Can you see where they've tried to address the issues that I've suggested you need to show in your writing? So, what we've got here, again, this isn't bad. There are some criticisms we could make of it, but they have suggested which methods are suitable. We've got data collection methods connected, individual interviews and focus groups. So we've got evidence of research and analysis to support those choices. Why, in the purple section, we're talking here, they've obviously, again, you can see very central to this paragraph, it's not theoretical. We can see evidence to the aims of the overall research project this student is undertaking. Again, I think a little bit more could have been added there, but generally they are addressing the issues. We've got some criticisms and limitations. And again, though, this student at the end, why haven't you chosen another one? Again, we can see here, no experience of moderating groups. Well, again, that's not really a justification. A dissertation is a huge learning undertaking. Would it have been possible to maybe have looked at ways of learning how to moderate groups? So be careful, again, making sure that limitations or any explanation of why one choice is made over another is supported with, realistic and accurate information, not just I couldn't do it. So again, this isn't bad at all. The overall purpose is to explore the level of work-life conflict which employees in the IT industry experience. Therefore, individual interviews which can provide sufficient information to answer not only the questions of respondents' viewpoint, but also how and why that response was given is the chosen data method collection. So we've got that explanation of what they wanted to do. I think that, they could have explored that a little bit more as to why individual interviews was really, pushed that a little bit further detail-wise. But generally, they're addressing the majority of the issues needed. And even in the areas that I've highlighted where perhaps their justifications are not really valid, they have tried to justify, but just be careful that you're justifying in an academic way. So you might want to go back to your plan, see if you can add anything to help build that up a little bit more. Can you add anything more about your methods? So now we're moving on to the section on research design. This needs to be very detailed. You need to sit down and plan this and make sure that everything that you did is included and explained. In a way, the way to think about this is to think about your research design as a set of instructions. Would somebody else be able to carry out your research based on the design that you're giving them? This is obviously a familiar concept to science students when we're talking about lab experimentation, which is the same as this section in your dissertation. But for others who maybe haven't done that before, it is a good way of doing it. If you gave somebody your research design, would they be able to go out and replicate or do again your research? You need to make it clear what you did. And you need to explain why that was a suitable or a useful approach. So this section needs to be very clear. If you recruited participants, how did you do that? And why was that method of recruitment the most suitable or the most useful? Who were the people that you recruited? Who were the people you interviewed? Who were the people you spoke to? Thinking about aspects of those people in relation to how old they were, their gender, these points. Thinking about how you collated your data and then you moved on to analyse it. Did you hand code? Did you use SPSS? So what you might want to do for this section is to just start writing down in order every single thing that you did. If you distributed questionnaires via social media, you will need to explain why that choice was made. Why is social media a useful way of distributing research questionnaires? And again, if we continue that example, what needs to be seen to the reader in this section is any possible problems that may arise in relation to your strategies and approaches in your research design, connected to how reliable the results may be and how valid they may be. So going back to social media, you will need to support that choice with some reading and reference to some research which suggests that this may be a positive or a good way of distributing questionnaires. But similarly, you will also need to look for any research that's done which points out some limitations around that. One thing that you might think about is a positive thing of sending out questionnaires via social media means that we can create a group of participants quite easily through our contacts. And there is maybe some research about that being a positive example of the use of social media in research. However, if we only sent out questionnaires to our contacts, were we really creating a valid representative sample group. Our majority of people in our social media contacts are of the same age range as us, same background. How much diversity was there in your group of participants then? And again, is there any research which comments on that? So what we need to see is what you did, detailed, how you did it. If you interviewed people, did you use structured, semi-structured, positives and negatives about that? Supported with evidence from research to explain the choices and also to help the reader build up a picture of possible issues that may be implicit in your research to do with reliability and validity. So, in relation to that, this section of research design will look very different for each of you, depending on your particular subject background. So here we have an example of a research design relating to experimental research. We've got details of equipment. We've got diagrams. And then here we've got a description of a research which looked at using surveys. And as you can see there, we've got analysis of, what went, how this was carried out, details, how it was made secure, how many questions, the scales that were used. So this is what we're needing to provide in our research design section. And if you're wondering, if you want to really focus on some of the points I've made, these questions are a summary of the things I've just been referring to. And again, you can use these to focus by answering them and then moving your answers, combining your answers with some research, some referencing to create the paragraphs which will be in this section. So, again, do you want to go back to your plan? Add to it. Remember, at the end of this presentation, that means that you're going to have a workable plan. If you use these questions, you're going to have a plan which you can start using immediately to start writing your chapter. Remember, really important, why. You're trying to tell the reader why you did this in this way, So why was there only 25 participants? Why did you heat something for a certain amount of time? Why did you add a stage? Why did you take a stage away? I need to know as the reader. I need to build a picture of your research choices, your research methods, and how you carried out your research. So we've looked at structure, we've looked at content. We're just going to turn here to language. Now, really important in this chapter that we are as clear as possible. Don't be vague. And this is something that is quite important because often we've discussed maybe our work with our supervisor and we've become familiar with names, with different, precise language. And so we forget to include it. Remember, you're writing this chapter as if the person reading it knows nothing is a good way of thinking about it. So if you use particular tests, make sure the names of those tests are clear. If you use particular scales or measurement tools, they need to be clear. Don't just say you analyze things with software. Which software did you use? This is really important. And remember, you explain. Your language reflects the explanation, the why. So what you can see there is a collection of phrases which you can use to do those things. And these phrases come from the Manchester Phrase Bank. The link is there. And this is a section within the phrase bank called Describing Methods. So if you'd like to look at some more examples, and I always suggest that, it might be a good idea once you've reached the stage where you've got your plan, you've thought about what's going to go into each section, you've finished any research necessary. Before you start writing, it's quite a good idea if you just pop open the Manchester Phrase Bank and have a read through the appropriate section, and this can start helping you as you start writing up in detail. So one thing you might want to do now is looking at the plan that you've created as we've gone through this session. Can you turn any of the notes you've made into 2 full sentences using, looking at your research design? Could you turn some of those points into sentences? This is a good way to start practicing and focusing. And again, this is a way of seeing how your plan then becomes writing. This is the value of planning. Because if you just started writing something without understanding the structure, without thinking about what you need to include, this is when we start getting in a pickle, we get in a mess. This is often why we come to these sessions, because maybe you've started writing this chapter, you've thought, I have no idea what I'm doing here. I don't know what I write about. I've been told to write so many words, but I think I could write this in 250. Well, now we've got our heads around what this should include. And we've seen central to this session is the building of a plan. Planning is absolutely vital. Because, with planning, we're giving ourselves time and space to consider elements that are important. And so if you have been sort of pondering and wondering about how to write this chapter, it could possibly be that you haven't thought about how to plan it. And again, this might be an issue with some of your other chapters in your dissertation. So again, go back to some of the resources that we've provided on the academic skills module, because writing a plan can be a really, really powerful way of moving ourselves from that I really don't know what I'm doing phase to feeling like we're beginning to gain control of what we need to do and what we need to create. So, remember, what are we doing with this chapter? Thinking about your approach to your research. Why did you select this? Why was this the best selection related to your topic, the objectives of your research? Thinking about the methods you used. Why were they the best related to your methodology, related to your research? I need to see very clearly how you created your sample. I need to see really clearly about how you created data. We need to also acknowledge, differences between any primary and secondary sources of data. And obviously this chapter does need to include some reference to ethics. So you will have received some ethics permissions from the university, and these need to be referenced and what exactly they mean in relation to how you kept your data safe, how you made sure that your participants were kept safe, this sort of information. So this is what we are aiming to achieve. At the end of reading this chapter, these are the points that the reader should be able to really clearly see in your structure and your writing. So obviously, if you have come to the end of this presentation and you were attending my webinar yesterday and you've come here because of the technical issues, I will be running a Q&A session on methodology chapters tomorrow at 2:00. If you've just found your way here because it's something you're interested in, please come along to that. If you've got any questions of any of the things I've said here or any other questions, remember that if you've got a lot of questions related to your particular research, it might be advisable to book a one-to-one session via the Skills at LMJMU tab on the student homepage, so we can discuss your research. But you come along to the Q&A and ask some questions. They can be specific, but if it's really connected to your research, a one-to-one might be better. There are some sessions running the rest of this week that you might find useful. This is a list of what we have running. So obviously, Rianne tomorrow is running a session on writing up your findings and discussion chapters. There's also a session tomorrow on academic writing style, which is really central to all academic writing. So if you want to just have a little bit refresh to make sure you're using academic style and tone across this chapter and anything else you're writing. Again, tomorrow we've got some sessions running on differential equations. If that's a strategy that you might have used in relation to your methods, your data collection, your data analysis, you might want to pop to that. Referencing, refresh, and then an introduction to qualitative data analysis using NVivo. So if you're at the stage where you've collected your data but possibly you haven't analysed it yet, that is a really good one to attend, because NVivo is a really powerful tool for helping you create your data. And then Friday, we've got dissertation question time, any questions about all aspects of dissertations. And then we've got, if you're an undergraduate student, we've got a session on literature reviews on Friday as well. So that's some additional resources. So again, if you were in my webinar yesterday, I apologise. Major internet issues, which hopefully will disappear. I hope you found this useful, and please come to the Q&A at 2 tomorrow. Thank you.